All right, everyone. I'm glad to be back with you for our third session on Catholic social teaching. Tonight, we'll be talking about family, community, and participation. And I'm looking forward to our time together this evening, and certainly looking forward to hearing what you've been thinking about since our last time together and what our conversation tonight will spark for you. I'm gonna hopefully avoid any technical difficulties tonight. That's my goal. And just remind everyone that you're always welcome to use the chat feature if there's a question or a comment you'd like to add to the conversation. Or if you'd like to raise your hand and alert me that you have something to add, that would always be welcome. So the overview for tonight, as I mentioned, the topic of our conversation tonight is family, community, and participation. So actually, we're combining two different principles of Catholic social teaching tonight. There's a principle that focuses on the family as kind of the nucleus of society, and then there's another principle focused on participation, and sometimes it's lumped together with the principle of subsidiarity, which involves taking action, social action at the lowest effective level. But I thought for our purposes, since we only had 6 weeks to work through Catholic social teaching, these principles really do fit well together. So I was hoping we could start just by sharing if there were any reflections or connections that you've made since our last conversation together. And then head into some of the key ideas related to the vocation of the family, and highlighting what this looks like from within and beyond the family unit. So that if you're a little rusty on your Latin, that's what those two terms mean on the screen. Ad intra is, within the family unit, and ad extra is beyond the family unit. And then to look at the relationship between families and their broader community. As families go, so goes society, and as society goes, so go families. So looking at that relationship, and then closing with this principle of participation. And tonight there should definitely be time for hearing plenty of your insights, questions, and having time for conversation. And you'll see on the left side of your screen here that kind of this focal quote from Familiaris Consortio, the apostolic letter from Pope John Paul II in 1981, where the Pope summarizes, the family has the mission to guard, reveal, and communicate love. And this is a living reflection of and a real sharing in God's love for humanity and the love of Christ the Lord for the church, his bride. So I think that's a pretty good summary in terms of what we're talking about tonight, which is principally, families as a communion of love, at least, at their very best. So, my hope is that I could maybe hear from a couple of you, just a couple of reflections, anything that you had been thinking about, or maybe if something was unclear in our conversation last week on trying to make connections between human dignity, human rights, and responsibilities.
I was thinking about the story that you were telling about becoming a father. And I was reflecting on the fact that I think when I became a grandparent, I saw things differently. And I think more now in terms of God as a godparent rather than as a mother or a father, because I felt that as a grandparent, I really first began to really understand what it meant to love unconditionally. I didn't feel that I had to be responsible for making sure that the kids grew up right or they made the right choices. I felt a tremendous responsibility as a parent, which I don't feel as a grandparent. And I guess it's Doris Klein, who is an artist. She did this thing that as God is a grandmother, and the fact that she has this thought in this little poem, it really was so nice. And I've used it many times to give as gifts to people who are becoming new grandparents. But it reminded me too of the book, The Shack,
Mhm.
how our idea of who God is really does affect how we relate to one another.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, no, that's so well said, Arlene. I think we can create God in our own image. Richard Rohr says we become the God we worship. So and I think this is true. You look around at the world, and there are a lot of people who imagine God as just a voyeur looking in on their life, just waiting for them to make a mistake and maybe throwing down thunderbolts to punish them. And it's really hard not to become judgmental and rigid and intolerant when your view of God is a God who's judgmental and intolerant. And then among my students, I have a great number of students who their view of God is someone who's kind of cold and disinterested and far removed from their life. And it's, I think, really hard to avoid becoming rather apathetic and to feel unloved or unlovable, to feel insignificant or invisible when your view of God is someone who doesn't really care much about you. I usually try to begin a class this time of the semester when it's cold and dreary, and we've had gray skies for weeks, with a practice that the Jesuit priest Anthony de Mello would encourage retreatants to try on, which is just to close your eyes and to behold God beholding you and smiling. And I think for so many of us, it's a little uncomfortable. We might squirm because we don't necessarily look in the mirror and like what we see. But I do think, Arlene, you're onto something there, that how we view God will certainly affect how we ought to, see ourselves as created in God's image and likeness, and what we owe each other. I always think of an encounter I had. I think I mentioned I got to serve as an assistant to Gustavo Gutierrez when he was teaching at Boston College. And I learned that Gustavo loves ice cream. Like, it's just one of his favorite things on the planet. And so there's a little ice cream shop across the street from Boston College, and I would, take him there after class. And he always orders vanilla. There's 30 flavors at this ice cream shop, but he always orders vanilla. And as he was enjoying, just savoring, just like he'd never had a vanilla ice cream cone before in his life, savoring this ice cream cone, he was telling me this story about how when he was a teenager, I think he was the youngest of the family, and he had several older daughters, 2 or 3 older sisters rather. And his father was a day laborer, and they were living in the slums of Lima, Peru. And his, because his dad was a day laborer, there were many days where he wouldn't get, his father wouldn't get any work, and food would be hard to come by. And when Gustavo's father would get work, he would go to the corner store, this little tienda, and instead of buying beans and rice, staple goods that could last for weeks, Gustavo's father would buy Gustavo and his older sisters ice creams, which would enrage Gustavo's mother because she knew, like, this is so frivolous, and do you know what I could be doing with this money if we could buy enough beans and rice? But Gustavo was sitting there, licking this ice cream cone and saying, this is exactly how God is with us. God doesn't just give us what we need, in terms of a bare minimum or just enough to survive. God lavishes love on us, and with this profound gratuity. And for Gustavo, if you get to spend time with his writings, you see that the first word in his entire theology is the gratuitousness of God's love. And that's what every person deserves, right? This life in abundance and for all. And if it weren't the gratuitousness of love, I think Gustavo's work would be totally different. If he had a different starting point, whether it was the misery of poverty or just how unjust it is that we have so many inequalities in our world, or the wretchedness of living in a slum. But the gratuity of God's love and abundant providence really makes for just such a different starting point. Lois, I see your hands up.
I was saying earlier to Marcus that I went back over some of my liberation theology notes that I had taken, and from my years in Latin America. And one of the things the definition of liberation theology, you hear so many different ones. The definition that they gave us, and that's at the conference in Peru, was the good news that makes people free.
Mhm.
And again, it's that whole idea of liberty and freedom that comes through God's power. And of course, you can see how the oppressors are certainly outnumbered, but they're realizing that this is God's freedom. And this is what God is sharing with us, and that we have the obligation to share that with others. And yet there's so many restrictions on this freedom that God gave us, as Mark was saying, gratuitously, and it's to be shared. And that we are all one, and even the number of articles of it, like liberty and freedom and all this, it's really key core issues of the heart. And it's so freeing if we really embrace it and realize it's not just something for me, it's community. We have to share it because we are one, and that's the message of the gospel. That's the good news.
Amen.
I was thinking when Arlene mentioned, I just want to lower my hand here now. The shack, what came to mind was my favorite line, and it kind of goes along with your discussing this idea of the gratuity of God, is the character of God in that book she says to everyone, right? When you see so-and-so, when you see Maria, tell her I'm especially fond of her. And I've never forgot, that's the line God uses for every person that God's talking about in the book. We're talking to someone else to go talk to them. But the other thing I wanted to say, we asked about some of the things from last week. So one of the things you mentioned, Marcus, was that I think it was Arlene again who said how the text of our Catholic social teaching documents can be a little dry and boring. And then you said, well, Aquinas said that all good communication is according to the mode of the receiver. And I've been thinking about that because I teach college students. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and like thinking about my responsibility to attend to the mode of my receivers and how I talk to 19 and 20-year-olds who, haven't studied theology or religion, or most of them haven't. Manhattan College was a school that years ago, the students who came to us were all products of 12 years of Catholic education by and large. But that's no longer true. I'm sure it might have been true at Xavier too, right? And others who've taught. And so we need a different conversation. And that's really important. And then with anyone else, we think about that. Who are we talking to? And how do we communicate in their mode that they can understand?
Yeah, thanks, Lois. It's a good reminder that there's work all of us can do to be translators. Maria.
Yeah, I was just thinking, the conversation about image of God and understanding who you are and the value of who you are as a human person. I tied that in with what we're talking about in terms of marriage and family, because the Pope was in big trouble this past week talking about people who love their dogs more than having children. But I was thinking that, without the family really being the first catechists who teach properly an understanding of God, you're always going to have kids that you meet in high school and college who think God is either irrelevant, distant, and not caring, or that judge who's waiting to catch them. So I think, human dignity begins in your sense of human dignity, and your value begins in your family, with your family communicating a very important message about who God is and how much God loves you. So all of us who are educators in some way, shape, or form, I think see the value of that in the family context.
Yeah, that's a great connection and lead in. Thanks, Maria. Anyone else with a reflection or connection from our conversation last time on human dignity, rights, and relationships?
Just one last point, and it keeps playing through my mind. When you go to Genesis 1, we hear finally that everything is good. that this God who loves abundantly, who creates out of that love and gives us freedom out of that love, we then, because we have that freedom, that free will, we cannot continue in the path of building a relationship with him, but maybe walk in the wrong direction. But I think we spend so much time worrying about, and I think Augustine sent us down this road, if we worry about the wretch who I am. And I think that that's disastrous for us when I always go crazy when I hear the song, A Wretch Like Me. No, I'm God's child. I'm part of the Godhead in a certain sense, because his breath of life is what gives me life. We spend too much time on the negative and not on the positive.
Yeah, John, I agree with you. I think the church has focused maybe too much on original sin and not enough on that original state of blessedness, what God dreamt for, or God's dream for us. That I think the reign of God or the kingdom of heaven, that's one of my favorite translations of that term is God's dream for creation, which is really, that's the central theme for Jesus' teaching and healing ministry. This is God's aspiration and hope. This is God's intention. And that's, the reason for all the healing that happens in the Gospels is to try to restore people to that sense of blessedness. As we talked about last time with the story of Bartimaeus, he was shunned and shamed and excluded because it was assumed he had done something to deserve his blindness. And Jesus not only heals him to cure him of his ailment, but to restore him to the community, to say that no one should be excluded, no one should be marginalized, no one should be less than. But you're right, we squirm, we all feel like we don't measure up or that we're an eternal disappointment, and God doesn't know what we're talking about. Okay. Oh, yeah, Cecilia.
I was going to say, and something else is the translation in Latin America. Rather than using the kingdom of God, they use the God's project. And a project is something that's ongoing, and everyone has a place in it. So I think that's the terminology.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, that word proyecto, it also implies work, right? Like this is a struggle. It doesn't just happen. It's not like, you flip a switch and here you are. It's an unfolding, but it requires us to be co-laborers in the vineyard. Great, good. Well, I look forward to hearing more insights and questions as we keep moving through the content for tonight. So as you know, we're going to kind of focus tonight on the dignity of the human family. And Gaudium et Spes really gets the credit for highlighting the family as the center for formation. What Maria was just saying a moment ago. You're right, Maria. I mean, that's the first place where we have any sense of self-image. It's, where our attachments tell us whether or not we can count on other people, what it means to feel safe with people and to trust others. And, realistically, families are all dysfunctional to some degree. And it's where we learn not just about fidelity and forgiveness, but also, betrayal and sometimes neglect. The families can be places of lasting wounds and sometimes the deepest wounds. And so Gaudium et Spes presents the family as a school for a deeper humanity, for example, in fidelity, especially the fidelity between spouses. As you know, the sacrament of marriage is supposed to reflect the fidelity between Christ and the church, which is why it's considered an indissoluble union. And that kind of loyalty is supposed to show us the kind of loyalty God has to us and that we are supposed to model for and with one another. This Vatican II document, Apostolicam Actuositatem, which came out in 1965, describes families as the first and vital cell of society and a domestic church, or a church in miniature, which, some people really appreciate those images because it kind of elevates the family and shows the sanctity of the family and ties into the universal call to holiness that we see in Lumen Gentium. But others are not so pleased with this presentation of the family as a domestic church, especially when we look at, for example, the Roman Catholic Church, which has this real rigid hierarchical structure It's was certainly marked by clericalism, and in some places, a pretty explicit hegemonic masculinity, where men are in charge of almost all of the decisions, authoring almost all of the documents, and even in canon law, we see that, like, even at the parish level, finance committees and pastoral councils, their role, according to canon law, is to be consultative to the pastor. That ultimately a finance council or a parish council has no power over the pastor. There's no checks and balances in the church, right? So we were really far from a community of co-equals, where there's mutual respect and co-responsibility and a power sharing model that is much more egalitarian. So feminist theologians in particular criticize this description of the family as a domestic church, because it can kind of assign a patriarchal image of what it means to be family, and ascribe that across cultures. And I think I mentioned to you in our first session that the church really didn't teach about the equality of the spouses until the pontificate of Pope John Paul II in the 1980s. So it's been a long, long time that the church promoted this patriarchal vision of family life as, a model of stability and order that, was very often something, a model of being family that enabled and protected abuse within the family. Not to air my dirty laundry in front of everybody, but there were stories in my family about abusive partners and heartache and trauma, and when women in the family would go to the pastor to seek counsel, and to say, what should I do about my husband when he gets so angry? The advice that the priest gave these women was, stop making your husband so angry. It was to kind of give this expectation that women should be deferential, and that the fidelity of their marriage was the greatest good, rather than the mutual respect or the agapic love that should be self-sacrificial. And so while the church, puts the family up on a pedestal, it's important to take a real clear-eyed look at family life. And there have been gross abuses in the church, right? My current research actually looks at clergy sexual abuse and tries to measure moral injury caused by both clergy sexual abuse in the church and its concealment. And we know that, thousands of priests in the United States have abused hundreds of thousands of individuals in the United States alone, right? Which is a moral catastrophe. And not to be flippant about the scale of that abuse or its concealment, we also know that 90% of sexual violence happens between acquaintances or family members. That more often than not, this happens, between romantic partners, or it's at the hands of mom's boyfriend or an uncle or a relative. And so I think it's really important, and I think this is actually something that the church continues to fail at, to address the ways that families fail to honor this vision of fidelity and agapic love, to be this communion of love that's supposed to reflect the equality and reciprocity of the Trinity. Augustine's vision of the Trinity is the lover, the beloved, and the love that bonds them together, love that is offered, received, and returned. And that's kind of this Trinitarian model is kind of supposed to be the template for family life. And we know that it's too rare that that's actually the case. I think, that was one of the attempts that Pope Francis was trying to make with the two synods on marriage and family life in 2014 and 2015, to actually hear about the experiences of family. And we see that much more in Amoris Laetitia than we do in Familiaris Consortio. So I think the church is trying to get to that awareness, but it's still got a lot of work to do. So in some of the passages that I invited you to take a look at this past week, if you had time for it, you'll notice that Pope John Paul II outlines 4 tasks for families in the 17th paragraph of Familiaris Consortio: forming a community of persons, serving life, participating in the development of society, and sharing in the life and the mission of the church, which is where I think it's really important that we make this, observation that to be family is to be focused ad intra, on the well-being of its members, but also the family has to be turned outward so that its interests, at its heart, are really dedicated to the common good and to the community. Our neighbors, the commandment is to love God and your neighbor as yourself. And so in our conversation tonight, I wanted to make sure that we highlight the ways in which family bonds can become idolatrous. I think especially in a Western context, or in an individualistic context, and in a hyper consumerist context. Children in the United States consume 40 times the resources, food and toys, clothing, all the rest, 40 times what children in the rest of the world consume. So we're spoiling our children rotten, while children all over the world, are starving and have very little. 20,000 children die every day because of preventable causes like inadequate access to potable water, inadequate access to nutrition, and problems like malaria, which, if we had the moral will, we could eradicate malaria. But instead, how much money are pharmaceutical companies spending so that men can get and maintain erections, because there's money to be made in those kind of drugs, but not to combat, plagues like malaria. This really took on an important meaning for me on a trip to Guatemala, where I got malaria, and I was able to hop on a plane and get home and recover just fine. But to know that that wasn't the fate of most other children, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, who get malaria. And on that trip, I was playing soccer with a bunch of kids. My wife is a nurse, so she was doing important, healthcare stuff, trying to run a public health clinic, and I was playing soccer with some kids. And I really got to know and enjoyed some time with this little boy named Kevin. And Kevin wanted me to go home and meet his dad. And so we're walking to his home, which was, a very simple structure in the middle of the campo, the countryside, no running water, electricity, a dirt wall, maybe some concrete blocks just to provide something of a reliable 4 walls that were, maybe a couple levels up, and then the rest was wood. And then there was, a tin roof with no screens. So it was just, an open air structure. And on the porch of Kevin's home, his dad was working there, stripped to the waist, working on a bag of corn that he was beating with a stick to try to shake the corn kernels loose from the cob. And he was dripping with sweat. I mean, just the amount of labor that he was doing it looked intolerable to me. I mean, just the amount of work he was doing. And so I struck up a conversation with him while he was getting a break from this work. And I asked him, how much money would you get for, this bag of corn? And he told me at the time it was, this certain number of quetzales, which I think, at the time translated to about $5. And I asked him, how much work went into that $5 that he would collect and how many bags he would do. And, by my estimations, he was doing an incredible amount of work for about $30. And he was going to have to stretch that $30 for months and months and months. And it just seemed stupid to me, that he was working so hard for such little money. And I might have been a little bit disrespectful, but I was just so overwhelmed that he was working so hard for such little money that I asked him what was the point. And he looked at Kevin and he put his arm around his son and he said, "Hay que luchar," which, in Spanish just means you have to fight or you have to struggle. Like just, matter of fact, like it's this or we don't make it. And, that hit me so profoundly as someone who loved his son and who was going to toil and do anything he could just to ensure food for his son. And it's something that, I feel accountable to now, many years later, where I'm raising 3 children in, a very different standard of living. And my wife is an only child. So my children are my mother-in-law's only grandchildren, and they often get spoiled. And I remember one day my mother-in-law gave our son Noah a fire truck because he loved fire trucks. And it was the 9th one that she had given him. And I lost my cool, not proud of it, but I just was, exasperated. Like, how many fire engines do we need in this house? And, and she was saying, well, every time I see a fire truck, all I can think about is how much fun Noah would have. And I still felt, morally compelled to point out that, there are children like Kevin who don't have anything, and yet we're showering with just this incredible generosity on kids who have more than enough. And so that's one of the things that I think Catholic social teaching provides us, is this prophetic critique of this. Well, the term for this is actually amoral familism, where it's a term that was coined by Edward Mansfield about 60 years ago, where, every family in America is kind of turned inwards on itself, seeking the best interests of that family and assuming every other family is doing the same. It's kind of, a live and let die mentality, or, a live and let live mentality, rather, which is really just a cover for a live and let die mentality. Just that, like, we're going to look after our own. We're assuming you're doing the same. But as John, you were saying, in your comments at the top of our time together today, there's no social consciousness. There's no social construct or contract. There's no vision of covenant, of a shared commitment to the common good. And that was something that I was hoping that you would kind of notice in the passages I highlighted for us at the end of our time together last time, especially when we look at the way Jesus describes family. So that's where we're going to turn in a second. But Lois, I see your hands up. So before we move to Jesus' description of the family, let's hear from you.
Excellent. Because I was thinking when you said the idea of in some of the documents, the family is held up very much as an ideal, and yet these latest documents have had a little more, maybe we could say, honest or critical eye or listening, like the Ecclesia Decens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Listening, yeah. So and I'm thinking that kind of, I was saying that reflects a little bit of the idea of having moved from being so deductive to trying to be inductive, but it's been slower to get to the inductive for, well, dare I say, like things that have to do with women, where women are a little more of the mainstay in the whole, equation maybe. And so that's interesting. Like women's experience would say, for a lot of women, right, families they are the most wonderful thing. I mean, there was some wonderful quotes, right, about families, the place where we have steadiness of love, large-heartedness, and the spirit of sacrifice. That's in Ganymed Spes. And yet it can also be dysfunctional and sad and difficult and hurtful maybe. But so we should admit that, right? And so it strikes me as an example of that another way of seeing things inductively as opposed to deductively.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. I think you're right. And if you noticed in Familiaris Consortio, Pope John Paul II tries to pay special attention to the experience of women, women's experience in families, women's experience in society and in the workplace. But I think now, 40 years later, it can sound awfully patronizing, and you can see where he's really operating with this complementary view, where there are roles for men and there are roles for women, and it's kind of, this very simplistic dualism, where you have these binary positions of male and female, but not a real sense of equality. And it's this kind of this presentation of biological determinism that, because of your sexuality, that determines your not only your identity but also your social roles. And that's another good segue to where I'd like to head with what Jesus says, because that's not Jesus' view necessarily. I mean, he kind of takes a very different view than I think we might expect when it comes to family. He has some kind of surprising lines here that I think still challenge us today. So as you know, Jesus affirms the marital bond, continuing to maintain marriage as an important social institution. And he's someone who's critical of divorce when asked about it. Although I think it's worth pointing out, I think it's important to point out that one of the reasons why Jesus is negative on divorce is because at the time, men could divorce women arbitrarily, right? And this is a time where women and their children are property, they're not persons. And so if a man wanted to arbitrarily leave his wife for another woman or someone else's woman, he could, and then his previous wife and those children would be susceptible to being trafficked or captured or bought or sold or traded. And so when Jesus, offers this prohibition of divorce, I think it's important to see it as a critique in defense of the vulnerable, women and children. He maintains this respect for parents and elders that we see, in the Ten Commandments, and elevates the dignity of children, which, I think is awfully endearing, when he is in that crowd of children and the disciples want to, shuffle them away and Jesus puts his arms around them. And again, this is awfully countercultural. We can think today, with Arlene's reflection on being a grandmother, how much grandparents delight in their grandchildren and the way that they are just the sunshine of our lives. But in Jesus' day, children were free labor. And there's some psychologists and historians who would argue that parents probably didn't get too attached to their children because the life expectancy was awful. Only 1 in 5 children made it to their 5th birthday. So they were losing children left and right. And again, they were seen more as property than as persons. So for Jesus to elevate the dignity of children and to show that they are precious, that their lives are sacred, is something that we should really see as a cultural critique of any way that children would be treated in a way that's less than or deprived their dignity and rights. It's not that once they turn 18, then they have rights. That children have rights because their lives are just as precious as the lives of adults, even though we do tend to infantilize our young people. I mean, Americans say on average that adulthood doesn't begin until age 25. So I don't know that we're always doing our young people a service and delaying adulthood. There's this critique of the generation of Peter Pan kids who don't ever want to grow up. So we've got to find a tension here between honoring children, but also emboldening them and empowering them so that they can embrace their dignity and rights with a full degree of agency. I think, especially important for our conversation tonight, Jesus minimizes the importance of blood ties. He says explicitly, whoever does the will of God is my brother, sister, and mother, which, is important for us because I think, again, going back to that concept of amoral familism that Edward Mansfield talked about 60 years ago, when we kind of circle the wagons and think only about our family, or I hear all the time parents who very proudly say, I would do anything for my children, I would die for my children, but then you ask them to be generous with other people's children and they can't be bothered. That this is where those family bonds can become awfully idolatrous, that we would just be endlessly generous with our kin and then indifferent to the needs or the suffering of others. And again, here getting to some of these surprising and challenging lines from Jesus. I've got a number of lines cited for you here on the slide. Discipleship should outweigh family loyalty, right? This is really about a commitment to the vulnerable, to the marginalized. The command is to love our neighbor as ourselves. The command isn't to love your brother or your father or your daughter. And that's not because those obligations don't matter at all. It's just that love comes to us automatically, right? Like it's kind of like, yeah, of course you're going to love those people, big whoop. The real work is in loving those people who, it doesn't benefit you to love, right? That's the kind of agapic love that we're called to practice, that's self-giving and selfless, that has no interests or contingencies or conditions or stipulations or strings attached. And that's really, how our fidelity to Christ is measured, is, the Beatitudes. And then this final line here, that followers should see ourselves as family members. So, when disciples ask Jesus, how should we pray? He responds with the prayer that we call the Our Father. But the word in Aramaic, that when Jesus gives this word to his disciples is actually Abba or daddy. It's this affectionate term that implies intimacy and safety and trust. And and it's our Father, right? Not my daddy and your daddy, right? But it's ours in a collective sense. So I think, really the take-home message here is that we have to think of family in kind of a call to inclusive kinship, where we see every person as belonging to God's single human family, and to see that we are all equals in God's eyes, that there aren't some lives that matter more or less than others. And I think this is why, I want to tie this to the call to conversion, that for Gustavo Gutierrez, everything is about conversion, right? Because we aren't sufficiently bringing good news to the poor and bringing about the freedom of people who are unfree, or those who are socially insignificant, the non-persons around us. And I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with Matthew 25, but that last judgment scene, the sheep are sheep, not because of their piety, not because of the checks that they wrote to the temple. The sheep are saved, not because they're Jews. The sheep are only saved because, someone was hungry and they gave them something to eat. Someone was thirsty and someone gave them something to drink. They were naked and they were clothed. They were a stranger and they were offered welcome. They were in prison and they were visited. And the sheep don't know they're sheep, right? In that story, they say, "What are you talking about?" And Jesus says, "Whatever you do for the least of your brothers and sisters, you do for me." And then he turns to the goats, and the goats don't know they're goats. What Jesus, what Lord, when were you hungry? When were you thirsty? When were you naked? When were you a stranger? When were you sick? When were you in prison? Because surely if we had known it was you, we would have done something. And Jesus says, "What you do not do for the least of your brothers and sisters, you do not do for me." So that criterion, singular, is what we do, not what we believe. And it's measured by how we treat those in greatest need. So I think, holding that intention, families as, this call to fidelity, this communion of love, to be this place of formation, but we can't overinvest in the nuclear family. Or, also to point out that the nuclear family is not really an accurate depiction of family life today, and very often it can make people feel awfully, ignored or invisible. We're all products of families, and those families look very differently, right? Whether we still have our parents with us or not, whether we're married or not. And I know, like when those synods came out in 2014 and 2015, I had a research assistant work with me to comb through the responses to the 72 question survey that people filled out across various dioceses in the country. And it was staggering to hear all the people who felt like they did not count when the church talked about family, because their parents were divorced and remarried, or people were widows or widowers and never acknowledged by the church, or they were single and the church just talks about the sacrament of marriage and the need to raise a family, and they felt like, well, what about me? So I think the church still has work to do in trying to really talk about the lived experience of family life today. Even if you were paying attention in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis highlights a variety of experiences of being family today, but he talks about families in irregular situations to talk about the circumstances of the divorced and remarried or same-sex couples. And I think the Pope is trying to be inclusive, but by calling them irregular situations, he's still making them feel like outliers or more exceptions than the rule. And so I think part of the challenge in front of us is to figure out, how do we really take seriously this vision to be a family of families that take many different shapes, this kaleidoscopic vision of family life that doesn't have to just be measured against a cookie cutter image of a nuclear family with 2 parents and children and so on, the white picket fence, 1.5 kids in the minivan. All right, so we have family life, a shared practice of love. And just a couple highlights for you. Families should be ordered to the good of their members, modeling loving right relationship ad intra as a communion of love through mutual respect and co-responsibility. And in Familiaris Consortio, Pope John Paul II says, love is therefore the fundamental and innate vocation of every human being. I ask my students this all the time: what is the meaning and purpose of life? And they look at me like they don't even know where to begin, which strikes me as so sad. Because for me, as a Catholic moral theologian, the meaning and purpose of life, the reason why we're here is love. It's all about love, right? And I always think of that line from Dorothy Day, my love for God is only as great as the love I have for the person I love the least. What an indictment of our failure to really receive the gratuitousness of God's love, totally unmerited, right? Not because we're good people or because we're well-behaved or because we're pious, but simply because we belong to God. And then certainly, our inability to extend that love, to be instruments of that agapic, unconditional, infinite love to other people. But that's hope. I mean, that's the vision of family life, right? Where people see that they were created in love and they're destined for love. And that's what it means to be human, is to participate, right? To be part of that Trinitarian vision of love that is offered, received, and returned. In the old, tradition, they talked about it through this term perichoresis, this flowing around of love, right? This dynamism of love that's shared. And that's what families are supposed to be modeling for and with each other. They always fall short, including mine, right? But that's the aspiration that we, just keep getting up and trying it again. I think, Pope Francis's real emphasis with Amoris Laetitia, that 2016 document that you might have been able to spend some time with this past week, you see the emphasis on accompaniment and mercy. And I like this line that Pope Francis says that, the church should be offering a word of both truth and hope, right? So to see reality for the way it is, right? Like not to sugarcoat it, but also to be aspirational, to think of that line from Seamus Heaney, that hope isn't optimism that everything will be fine, not the toxic positivity, it'll be fine, but it's the firm commitment, the belief that there is good worth working for. And in his remarks, when Pope Francis came to Philadelphia, he talked about the family as a factory of hope, or sometimes that it's translated as a workshop of hope. And I love that, because I think, as a father of 3 young children, I get so much hope from seeing my children's curiosity and openness to growth and their generosity and just their default setting to give people the benefit of the doubt. They are the least judgmental, they're the least intolerant, they're the most generous people that I know. And they're so filled with awe and wonder and reverence. Everything is amazing. My son Benjamin is super into space, and he just, like, his mind is blown that space never ends. He just thinks that's so cool. And he asked me, Dad, is that what it's like when you talk about how God is infinite, or absolute mystery? I mean, he's stuck with a theologian for a dad, so he's heard that a couple times. But the fact that as an 8-year-old kid, he can make those connections between space that never ends and a God who never ends, that kind of wonder and awe and reverence. I think that's what Jesus means when he talks about having a childlike faith, that we just see the world in awe, just seeing the good in and around us and being moved, being changed by the good that's in and around us. You might be familiar with that definition of contemplation by Walter Burkhardt, taking a long, loving look at the real. I think children are so good at that. And at their best, families are, places where we can, just savor the long, loving look at, these people who love us, warts and all. So, in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis writes about the church as a family of families. Families don't always get along. There's bickering, there's division, there's falling outs, there's arguments. There are always opportunities for forgiveness and reconciliation. But I really like this line, that families rely on a love that never gives up. Pope Francis talks about the fact that love has no alibi. If we really are committed to love, then we can't be let off the hook, that we can't be excused for indifference or ignorance in the face of other people's needs. But then he calls the church, he says, our task here is to form consciences, not replace them, as we talked about in our first session. And that, really the task of the church is to embrace this logic of pastoral mercy, to model tenderness. And I have this quote on the right, that tenderness is not weakness, it's fortitude. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis talks about this need for a revolution of tenderness to really bring people together in a spirit of mercy, solidarity, and hope. And I think families need that more now than ever. And as you may know, previously the popes have described families as a leaven for society. The yeast in the dough that helps us rise and aspire for this, to respond to this universal call to holiness, and to deliver on our duties in pursuit of the common good. That this is where we have this shared work, that it's not on our shoulders individually, but that we do this collectively as members of families. And this is a little bit of a long quote at the bottom here, but I think it's worth highlighting just this, this goal to connect dignity and solidarity for trying to deliver on respect, justice, and the common good. That this is how families are the bridge between what's good for individuals and what's good for society. So that's setting up, kind of this middle point for our time together tonight, just with a reminder that Catholic social teaching rests on a relational anthropology, that, what's good for human life is inherently public or social, so that, theology and faith can never be privatized. And I think we, again, in our individualistic society, we kind of think about our relationship with God as between me and Jesus, or it's something that I keep, to myself. But really, if we're going to take discipleship seriously, it means we have to take responsibility for each other. And Catholic social teaching raises this moral question of how should we organize society, or what kind of society can we build so that we really are delivering on human dignity and human rights. So if we take seriously this idea that families form the fabric of community, then they have to be oriented to the good of their local communities. This is a link to the principle of subsidiarity, taking action at the lowest effective level, which we will talk about at our penultimate session together. So I'm going to bracket that for now. But I wanted to make this important connection to government, because I think a lot of people assume that the work for peace or the work of charity, or even the tasks of justice, that this is for individuals to do as an illustration of their faith commitment, or that it's something people can opt into or opt out of, or it's for the private sector. But just as an example, if you took all of the food that's collected by churches and not-for-profits, all the canned good drives in a given year, and you collected them, and then you compared all of the food collected by churches and compared that to what the government provides in food assistance, and you divided it up into grocery bags. Let's say you have 24 grocery bags. What percent do you think, or how many of those grocery bags would be from the private sector, and how many of those would be coming from the government out of 24 grocery bags? How many would come from the private sector as a proportion? Kathleen?
I would guess about 20 from the private sector.
Okay. Not a bad guess.
It's those who don't have who are more generous with what they have. That's my experience.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true, John. The answer is one. One of those 24 grocery bags comes from the private sector. The other 23 come from government assistance, right? And that's really important, because like Kathleen, most Americans think that the private sector or churches or not-for-profits have enough scale to address the need of 350 million Americans, but we don't. It's not even close. I mean, think about all the food that's collected by good-hearted people, and yet it is just a drop in the bucket when you compare it to the funding for SNAP or WIC, which really still, is woefully inadequate in so many cases. So this middle section here on government, I think, is really important, because so many Americans think that if you want to be generous, that's great, do it on your own dime. But they don't consider the scale of the need that exists in our country, to say nothing of the standard of living in the developing world, right, which is still way behind what human dignity and human rights require. So Catholic social teaching has been really explicit here, and this is not something, unfortunately, we hear much from when it comes to the USCCB. But Catholic social teaching is very clear about the need, if we're going to take seriously what's good for families and good for communities. That means people need adequate access to quality education and healthcare. They need access to affordable housing and childcare. They need paid family leave and a living wage, or as Laborum Exercens says, the document that was written on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, that we need a family wage. The Pope argues that one working adult should make enough to be able to provide for the whole family, so that one member of the family could be home with the children to provide for all of the needs of that child. We are so far from that, it's not even funny, right? Like the minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009, right? It's $7.25 an hour, which is actually below what people were earning in the 1960s if you adjust for inflation, right? But again, people just say, oh, well, these are low-skilled jobs. If you want to get a better wage, then go to school, or, they make all these arguments or excuses, but we are so far from a living wage, what was actually enough to provide for oneself or one's family. Lois, I see your hands up. You're muted, Lois.
I was thinking when you were talking about the grocery bags, a few years ago, I had a statistic from one of the housing organizations nationally that talked about, the good work of Habitat for Humanity, right? That but volunteers on a Saturday afternoon can't possibly, and they were using the city of Minneapolis. They talked about how, they could do, I don't know, a few score of houses maybe, but the need of the population of the city of Minneapolis for affordable housing was like, 25,000 units or 50,000 units. And I am stuck on this conundrum that people have. I guess he's my first cousin once removed. I don't know, he's younger than I. He's my cousin's son, who I guess if I described him, we have these debates on Facebook as people are inclined to have. And, but it's always, he's very much, I guess, a libertarian. I don't know what else to say. And so I shouldn't say fancies himself. I don't mean to denigrate he presents himself as a very serious Catholic. And yet when I talk about social policies or changes in the tax structure, or it's completely he thinks Habitat for Humanity or the grocery bag should be enough. And I'm torn between whether or not, and I don't know if this is the place to discuss this now or another time, but is that based on because we haven't shared this information enough about what our faith actually teaches us? Or is it he lives a nice, comfortable lifestyle in the suburbs, and it would maybe cost him something? I mean, I guess it should cost me more too, but I mean, I'm aware of that, I suppose. And I suppose that's the sticking point, is it? That what is it that prevents people who he would say pro-life. It's really, in my estimation, about being anti-abortion, and so pro-life to me is the Jim Martin definition of pro-life, like all those things that the slide you used. So I guess I'm stuck on that a little bit about how do we get people to think these things if they really think the gospel is really about, I think they think it's about me and God. It's not about us and God.
Yeah. Thanks, Lois. I mean, I think it's not an either or there. I think it is people totally unaware of what the tradition actually teaches, and not seeing the way that this is a biblical account of justice. It's not, something that we impose on the tradition, right? Like especially you can see here at the very bottom, the universal destination of goods, that the goods of the earth are intended for everyone, not just a select few. That's from Leviticus, right? Like that's not Karl Marx or some woke philosopher making this argument and advocating for communism, right? This is actually how Scripture measures our fidelity to God, is by making sure that everyone has enough. St. John Chrysostom has a number of homilies where he's explicit in saying, if you have 2 cloaks in your closet and there are people in your community who don't have any clothing, those cloaks belong to the poor. Or if you have an extra store of bread in your house, that you are stealing from the poor because that bread belongs to them. And so we're going to talk about this more next week when we talk about economic justice and the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Because I think, again, going back to the consumerist society that we're living in, we've normalized greed. And I think, Lois, to your point, there are a lot of libertarians in this country who, have say, I've got mine, Jack, and other people can too. And that's a function of not only maybe ignorance of what the tradition actually teaches, but as you mentioned, an ignorance of what it's like to be someone other than me. I mean, in the research that I did for my book on the ethics of encounter, it was really sobering to find out just how divided we are as a country, not only ideologically, but the way that we live. 75% of white Americans don't have a single Black friend, and 2/3 of African Americans don't have a single white friend. The vast majority of Americans live in zip codes where they are surrounded by people who look like them, who shop like them, who vote like them. I mean, even in my neighborhood here in Cincinnati, it's racially and economically diverse, but there were, for every 100 Biden signs, there were 1 or 2 Trump signs. And then you go out into, the suburbs or into the rural area, and it's the exact opposite, right? But we really are living in very divided. I mean, sociologists describe it as homogenous lifestyle enclaves, where we're in pockets with people that are that look like us and think like us, and we don't really encounter people who have way different views or way different needs. So, your example of Habitat for Humanity is perfect, because in Cincinnati, we are 40,000 units short on affordable housing, and a huge problem of people who are unhoused. And there are a lot of churches who are supporting Habitat for Humanity, or who are collecting money, to try to provide rental assistance. I mean, my parish, Bellarmine Chapel, the Jesuit parish on Xavier's campus, we do a lot of collections for rental assistance. But again, that can help out half a dozen families any given month when you have 40,000 units that you're short on in terms of affordable housing, and so many more people who are struggling to make ends meet. The charity model is woefully inadequate, but I think that's the dominant model that's been presented to Americans, and it fits our individualistic mindset, right? Like, I can write a check and feel good about myself, but we don't think about the structural level and the scale of the problem, and how we need macro level policies and practices to really deliver on what's due to people. And I think, the analogy between charity and justice is kind of like the old story that you might have heard, where there's a woman walking through the woods and she hears someone calling for help, and she runs over to the river and she sees someone drowning, and she pulls that person out of the river. And the next day she's walking through the woods and she hears someone yelling for help, and there's another person who's drowning, and she pulls that person out of the river and offers her, assistance, which is wonderful, right? Like, that's charity, that meeting an immediate need, even if it's life-saving aid, that's wonderful. But it's not justice. Justice would mean going upstream and doing something about the broken bridge, and to actually address the root cause of why people are falling into the river in the first place. And in this country, we don't train people to do the root cause analysis, or to figure out what are the root causes of the problem, and then how do we try to do the preventative work, to say nothing of the redress for exclusion or exploitation. Because in medicine they say prevention is the best cure. If we had more proactive policies to help with dependent care, or paid leave, or all of these things, or even affordable health care, boy, it would make a world of difference for individuals, for families, and for communities. I mean, 1 in 5 Americans are saddled with medical debt. That's keeping people from retiring on time. Sometimes it's making people sell their homes, right? Like, these are really heavy burdens that people are carrying, and it's weighing people down, certainly keeping them from flourishing. Arlene?
That basically was going to say the same thing, in terms of that. I think we look at charity and feel good that we've done something, but we don't see it as justice. Mm-hmm. Too many things get passed off as that it's charity, when it's really justice. So just reiterating what you said.
Yeah, Prinika.
Yeah.
When I first came, I worked in fast food restaurants for some time, until I learned English and go to school and all that. So the minimum wage at that time was $5.15 per hour, $5.15. And after tax, I got $4. So I had to work about 70 hours to pay for my rent, my phone bill, get my Metro card and all that. Then when I hear people say, oh, they just don't want to work if they just get a job, but people cannot live in minimum wage. I was a single person, so I was able to manage it and work that much. But if you have a child and all that, nobody can live in minimum wage. But people don't realize that.
They don't. No. Yeah, I mean, in Wisconsin, I was a waiter in college, and my hourly wage was $2.22 an hour. And they justified that by saying, oh, you'll make tips. But boy, there were a lot of lunch shifts where, you know, I had 3 tables, and there was still no way that after working 3 hours, I was going to make anything close to a living wage. Yeah. So finally, we're getting to the last piece of the conversation tonight, this principle of participation, which I think is so important because we are living in this individualistic culture where people think that they can opt in or opt out. It's the live and let live mentality that just as easily becomes live and let die. And people focus on pet projects. You know, we spend a lot of money on hobbies, on, you know, preparing our kids so that they have an impressive resume so that they can go to college and succeed, right? Like we want to invest in our children so that there'll be some, you know, return on investment, as people say in the economic sphere. But we don't think about all the ways in which, you know, being human means to just share life together, and human dignity and human rights requires that people have full and equal access to participate in society. You know, that this is a shared gift and task, and that we have to be vigilant against any kind of exclusion or marginalization where people are deprived access to participation, to be agents of their own future, you know, to have a say in their fate, rather than, I mean, that's the other problem with the charity model. Charity trains people to be dependent on other people and just wait around for others to be generous. And that's what I really appreciate about this principle of participation. It calls everyone to get to a hands-on approach so that it's not the super generous are providing for other people out of their beneficence, you know, but that everyone has a role to play, you know, in being co-workers in the vineyard. And I want you to look for that in the reading that I'm going to ask you to take a look at for next week when we're looking at economic justice and the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Pay attention to that gospel story in Matthew 20, the workers in the vineyard, where, you know, the overseer it goes out a couple times to find more workers because there's just too much work and not enough work. And think about what that story is about. A lot of times that story gets spiritualized. So people think it's just about, you know, if you find God late in life, you'll be just fine. That's stripping what Jesus is talking about. And it is certainly a story about participation. This is a long quote here from Gaudium et Spes, but I think it merits our attention. The will to play one's role in common endeavors should be everywhere encouraged. Praise is due to those national procedures which allow the largest possible number of citizens to participate in public affairs with genuine freedom. So again, the church is on guard against coercion. And so this has to be to advance both human dignity and authentic human freedom. If every citizen is to feel inclined to take part in the activities of the various groups which make up the social body, these must offer advantages which will attract members and dispose them to serve others. So, and that's the key, right? Like, this is about serving others. It's not the pursuit of my own interests or my own agenda or what benefits me or my kids. The norm here, the moral norm, is service and meeting the needs of the others, especially the most vulnerable. We can justly consider that the future of humanity lies in the hands of those who are strong enough to provide coming generations with reasons for living and hoping. So again, going back to this focus on hope, I think it's so beautiful. Going all the way back to Gaudium et Spes, we see this emphasis on participation as a reason for hope. When you see people, you know, go from spectators to stakeholders, that is reason to inspire hope. And then the 1971 synod document from the bishops of the World Council of Bishops justice in the world, we see that the right to development may be fulfilled by action. People should not be hindered from attaining development, right? So we have to be on guard against exclusion or dependence. Or the white savior complex, just here I come to save the day, where everything is about me making a difference and feeling good about myself, and all those poor people that we helped, were so great. But the vision here is for mutual cooperation. All people should be able to become the principal architects of their own economic and social development. Again, I think those kind of visions of architects give us an image of people who are builders, that we need that. We need a constructive turn here because of all the disdain and distrust in our social setting. So instead of just lamenting the state of the world, to say, what more is God making possible? And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says that social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. So thinking about what are the pre-existing networks that we can leverage, not trying to always be creating new networks, but to say, what are the relationships? What are the networks that we can marshal so that people who are already connected can maximize and magnify those efforts by working collaboratively together? Lois, I see your hands up.
I was so combining these together. I would want to ask, or maybe it's a little bit of a challenge, I don't know, to say that the two, Justitia in Mundo and Laudato Si, might ask us to challenge or see Gaudium et Spes in a different way. So I think, Marcus, when you were saying how we interpret that first paragraph, it was more about us and from our perspective and maybe our social location, which I take to be a lot of the folks involved in this. I'm not sure, but I feel like there are a lot of people I could identify with, or we might have similar backgrounds or social location. And yet when you're organizing folks or working with folks who are going to become the subjects and not the objects, or the protagonists in their own destiny, right? They are actually working for themselves in a sense, right? I mean, they're working on their own behalf in service to themselves and their community, but on issues and problems and social disruptions that they identify very locally. I mean, I did a lot of that work for 10 years in the Bronx, where we weren't really asking anybody else to help us. We were working from the grassroots up in terms of the condition, no heat, no hot water, or crime or drugs, or city services. I mean, garbage being dumped on empty lots in neighborhoods as waste stations on the way to the final dump. It was like pretty disrespectful in a community, right? So it's interesting that real participation from the very grassroots, which I think this calls for, is challenging, and it is people working in their own self-interest with ever widening circles of understanding self-interest into the larger and larger human family, I think. Anyway, that's just something that it's out of my own experience, so maybe more
I think, again, instead of it being an either or, I think it's a both and, because I think our interests are interlinked. Like if I pay higher taxes so that there's less crime in my neighborhood, or that that there are more alternatives to for young people to pursue a good education or job training so that they don't have to resort to crime, that benefits me, right? It'll keep my family safer. Property taxes will, property values will rise, right? Like, so I think that actually it's a marker of our interdependence, that those personal interests are actually social interests and vice versa, and that we can benefit from being selfless. I don't want to get into the chicken and egg debate of, that I don't know if you know the show Friends, but there's an episode where Phoebe's in a crisis because she doesn't know if there's any genuinely selfless act, because she thinks every time she does something nice for someone else, it makes her feel good. I think actually this is part of what it means to be social beings, that when we do good and when it makes a difference in other people's lives, there's a benefit that can't be, ascribed to quantities, like 3 units of good for you versus 2 units of good for me, right? Like we can't quantify it. It's just part of sharing life together. And, when other people enjoy freedom and enjoy greater agency, that should benefit us, whether it's something or not we even are aware of. Maria, what did you want to add?
Something that maybe, I guess this got conjured in my head as I'm listening to it. When Lois was talking about this cousin who's this very good Catholic and, believes everybody else should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And, I think the church has failed when it comes to Catholic social teaching. When you think about the whole Catholic educational system, we, for the last 70 years, have taken people, we'll start with the immigrants coming in the early 1900s. And what were we teaching them in this system? To integrate into society, to move from poverty that they left on the old sod, and to move up and to become prosperous and so on and so forth. I can see this. I'm Italian, and I look at some Italian immigrants that I know. They came here with nothing, they made everything, and they are absolutely not interested in sharing anything with everybody else. Everybody should toe the hard line. And where do they get that from? They go to church, they get, you're good, you've made it, you've arrived in society. And I think that the Catholic education and the church has done a good thing in terms of bringing people from a generation of poverty to a generation of well-being. But they haven't done, along with that, the education that would make those people who have moved from poverty to well-being also understand that they have an implicit obligation to not look at the generations behind them and say, we went through the school of hard knocks, and when you look at it, they didn't. I was talking to somebody today, education 50 years ago in Catholic school cost $0. You go to the high school that I'm living on the campus, it's $14,500. So we all got education on the backs of free labor. And from that, we moved from a generation of immigrant parents to the well-being that we have. But along the way of moving people to economic well-being, we didn't teach them Catholic social teaching. I don't know if that makes sense, but just what I'm thinking about our failure.
Yeah. Well, and I think so that points to the failure to really help us understand our relational anthropology, that, it can't be ethnocentric, and just focused on a subset of, the human family, and a failure to think longitudinally, intergenerationally, and really know the stories of the people, who benefit, we benefit from, or to think about what we owe future generations. And that's something we'll look at the very end when we get to care for creation, and, how are we going to answer to future generations based on the condition of the world that we've left to them. Mary Alice?
Yeah, this is fascinating, and so many questions, but there was a question that you had earlier that I still think we haven't answered. And maybe it's the question that you're going to answer throughout the whole, but how should we organize society? And I think we're afraid to educate. I think we're afraid to put the teaching out there. For example, I'm very interested in trying to find a way to get people to vote, but how do you do that? And as Catholics, we're afraid of these things, and I think the fear, it just holds us back. Even if we believe this with our whole being, we're still not getting it out there, and I don't have the answer. That's one of the reasons I wanted to join this dialogue, to seek the answer. But I do think fear is a big part of this.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's the fear of alienating wealthy donors.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, to put it as plainly as I can, right? Like those wealthy donors are beneficiaries of an unjust status quo.
Mhm.
And I don't know that our church leaders really want to hold up the mirror and have them reflect on the ways that they accumulated wealth through exploitation or exclusion, by not paying workers a living wage. In this country, we tend to think that philanthropy is going to solve every problem, and that's an excuse for people to be greedy and to accumulate wealth. And again, that defies justice, which I think my next slide is yes, it's an illustration of justice, just so that we're all on the same page, because I think justice can mean so many different things to different people. And then Maria, we'll make sure that we have time to hear from you. But I think a lot of people, when they hear justice, they can think of it in a legal framework, like vengeance or in, criminal justice. And then you have like all these buzzwords with the diversity, equity and inclusion models, or DEI for short, which, then can, I think, become pretty secularized. So I think this is a helpful illustration of what are we talking about. So we can see, on this top left image, right? Like inequality exists, right? We're living in an unjust status quo where some people receive unearned benefits and others are deprived their dignity and rights. Equality, is not the answer, because it just treats everybody exactly the same. And it doesn't do anything about the root cause, which is the unequal benefits or unearned benefits for some and the deprivation that other people experience. So, the solution is not communism. Let's just treat everyone exactly the same. Equity is this new buzzword which tries to blend in fairness. And that might get us a little bit closer. You can see now this person has a taller ladder, but it still doesn't address the root cause, right? The bend in the tree that, there's way more fruit on this side. So it tries to level the playing field. But when we're talking about justice, and the biblical conception of justice is fidelity to the demands of a relationship. We'll talk about this, in the next couple of weeks together. But it really is this vision of covenant, that we have these obligations to each other, and that our fidelity to God is measured by the conditions of the most vulnerable, the ones who are most prone to exclusion or deprivation. And so you can see charity is nowhere near enough, right? Like we can't just do enough to hand out apples, because then people are dependent on the handouts. What we really have to do here is this structural change, right? To change the inequalities at their root cause. Okay, Maria, you've been patient.
I was just going to offer the observation that I really think that for meaningful change to occur within individuals, in terms of what we've been discussing, that the statements really have to come from the leadership of the organized church, especially within this country. And I know when I read the statement that was made recently by, I guess it was the chair of the United States Conference of Bishops, Catholic Conference of Bishops, where the allusion was made to social programs and classifying it as a pseudo-religion or dismissing it as a pseudo-religion, that I think it's going to be hard to expect change within individuals when statements like that are made. And in fact, just the opposite of that type of statement needs to be made. Again, if we do want individuals to embrace the need to change the thinking from, well, everybody's has to work hard, and if they want to have some material comforts, or if they want even adequate food or water, and that was just my observation, was that I really do think that these firm statements need to come from the leadership, and when they're not, I don't think it's likely there's going to be substantial change.
Yeah, Maria, I think you're right. And I think that's part of the problem that Pope Francis is experiencing with the USCCB is, he has people like Archbishop Gomez, who made the statement you referenced, who are, actually actively working against not only what Pope Francis is trying to do, but this 130-year-old tradition of Catholic social thought that is, trying to, as I've tried to point out, right, like the church trying to present itself as an expert in humanity and not saying this is a third way or a middle way between conservatism or progressivism or communism or libertarianism, but to say, no, this is actually what human dignity, human rights, and responsibilities require, nothing more, nothing less. I know we're getting overtime here, so I'm going to just try to land the plane and send us off, and we can pick this up next week. But in terms of implications and applications, what does this mean? So first of all, we need a commitment to practice respect, compassion, accompaniment, and inclusive solidarity for families of all walks of life, especially the marginalized. That's something that we see a little bit in the Mars Laetitia. You can see those parenthetical notations there. Confronting social distrust and division, overcoming obstacles to dialogue. That gets an entire chapter in Fratelli Tutti. That's the FT on your screen there, parenthetically. A new way to practice dialogue as an exercise of solidarity. And that's how we'll end our time together at the very end of this course is with Fratelli Tutti, the newest encyclical to be added to this canon of Catholic social thought. And to vote, I can't remember who said this previously, but the principal participation requires that we promote access to the polls, people to be able to raise their voice, to hold our elected officials accountable. I can't think of a single time I've heard the USCCB talk about voter suppression, or especially the way that voter suppression has been targeting people of color or communities of color. There's so much, they're hyper focused on the issue of abortion. And then after the murder of George Floyd, there was maybe some oblique references to racial justice, although the protests for Black Lives Matter is part of this pseudo religion that Archbishop Gomez is denouncing. He sees justice as kind of a dirty word or a way that the church is being co-opted by leftist agendas. But absolutely, no attempt to hold the GOP accountable for, by last count, over 250 efforts to restrict access to voting across the country. If you look at the pieces of legislation being proposed and in some cases already passed to make it harder for people to vote, that is problematic if you take seriously the principle of participation. I think, something we weren't able to talk about tonight, but is really important. There are some theologians and moral theologians who argue that the principle of nonviolence and peacemaking is absent in the body of Catholic social thought, and something that we are really hopeful that will be developed. God willing, if Pope Francis has a few more years in him, there's word that actually there's another encyclical in the works that would look at the principle of nonviolence and the necessary steps toward peacemaking, including, the abolition of developing nuclear weapons and to call for nuclear disarmament in a way that, Fratelli Tutti denounces and condemns capital punishment. So there's more work to do. You can see there aren't many references there. There's Gaudium et Spes, Centesimus Annus, and then Fratelli Tutti, where we see some connections between the family, community participation, and the need to embrace nonviolence and peacemaking. But that's really essential if we're going to create any kind of grassroots change in the face of conflict or the threat of violence. And just as a concrete example here, there's a really great book that just came out a couple of years ago, A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence. And the last third of this book are all detail various examples around the world where nonviolent resistance was effective in creating change. In fact, far more effective than armed insurgencies. You can see armed insurgencies lead to democracy less than 4% of the time within 5 years. But nonviolent civil resistance attracts 11 times more participants and is twice as successful as armed insurgencies around the globe to respond to violence or depose despots since 1990. So we've run out of time for conversation, unfortunately, but I will start our session next time asking you whatever reflections or connections you might have cultivated over the last week. And I wanted to deliver on my promise to provide you access to more resources if you're interested. You know, the classic text when it comes to family is by Lisa Soul Cahill. The book is called Family, A Christian Social Perspective. That book is about 30 years old, but it's still kind of the classic text. But two really good subsequent texts on family as, you know, focusing ad intra on the good of its members and then ad extra to the common good would include Julie Hanlon Rubio's book, Family Ethics, which is fantastic because it looks at actual practices that families can adopt. It's very practical. And then a brand new book. It's an award-winning book that just came out in the spring of 2020, Sex, Love, and Families, Catholic Perspectives by Jason King, edited by Jason King and Julie Hanlon Rubio. Some really great chapters there, looking at mass incarceration, immigration, just, you know, a variety of social issues and connecting that to family life. I have a chapter in there looking at digital technology and social media and the way that that's impacting families. You know, even before the pandemic, parents were spending more time on Netflix than they were with their kids, you know, interacting with their children. So I'm interested in kind of the moral impact of those digital devices and digital technology that can kind of make it harder to be attentive and responsive to the people right in front of us. There's a great book on, you know, Toward Thriving Communities through a virtue ethics lens there in the middle. And then because we didn't have as much time to talk about nonviolence and peace, I wanted to highlight two new books. One, Blessed Are the Peacemakers by Lisa Soul Cahill, and then that primer from edited by Eli McCarthy, who's at Georgetown. All right, so for next time, if you can take a note of this, if you have time, we're going to focus on the dignity of work and the rights of workers. The passages that I think would be helpful to take a look at if you have time would be Matthew chapter 6, verses 24 through 34, and then especially that story about the workers in the vineyard in chapter 20. I'd definitely like to hear your thoughts in response to that. And then the whole document, Laborum Exertions, is only 27 paragraphs. It's among the shorter documents in the canon of Catholic social teaching as a 90th anniversary document. But it certainly, I think, is a great resource for looking at the dignity of work and the rights of workers. And then I think a really underappreciated document is the USCCB's Economic Justice for All in 1986. We're going to take a look at that. It was really panned when it came out in the 80s. And really, I think it was the last time the USCCB showed much moral courage in trying to be a prophetic voice, because they got so roundly criticized. You know, the bishops didn't know what they were talking about when it comes to economics. But it is a profound document. We just celebrated the 35th anniversary in 2021, and I hardly saw any notice of it, which is just so sad, because between that and the Challenge of Peace, their pastoral letter in 1983, calling for peace, you know, they really were exercising this moral courage and prophetic voice that, you know, we just haven't seen in the same way ever since. But if you have time to spend with that document, it's really rich, and I think you'll find it interesting. Those first paragraphs talk about kind of the theology of this dignity of work and the rights of workers. The second segments, paragraphs 186 through 214, are policy suggestions. So the bishops really try to be well informed, you know, by listening to economists and exploring what it would actually take to answer Mary Alice's question: how do we organize society for all to flourish? So, Mary Alice, if you have time to look at Economic Justice for All, let me know what you think.